Ele está numa reunião do processo, aliás, diz respeito a alguns de vocês, do processo seletivo do doutorado. Então ele pediu para eu abrir a sessão. Eu queria, acho que dispensa a apresentação, o professor Dominique Pion, mas só falar em poucas palavras. Ele é professor da Universidade de Paris 13, ele acabou de se aposentar, mas é professor emérito lá. E tem, além da academia, uma longa experiência também no Banco de France. Então, quando ele fala sobre regulação financeira, ele fala também de alguém que já viveu um pouco isso, né? Tem também uma militância na ATAC, que é a Associação Baixa Pública. E amanhã, já antecipando, ele vai falar sobre a crise da Zona Euro, vocês devem saber. E o tema de hoje, então, é a regulação financeira e bancária, sobretudo na Europa. So, thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you very much. Hello to everyone. Thank you for inviting me and the possibility to have an exchange of view with you, because I will make a presentation, but after this presentation I will be happy if you can raise questions, tell me what you think. Maybe you do not agree with some of my hypotheses, some of my conclusions. So I'll be happy to talk to you, because it's a very important topic, I think, financial regulation, but also it's a very controversial topic. We have a lot of discussions today, a lot of debates among economists, even among heterodox economists. We do not agree, all of us. So there are differences, and it's interesting to have exchange of views. So I will try to be not to be too long for my presentation. We always say that, and then we are always longer than we thought, but I try not to be too long, and then please happy to have your questions. If you want to interrupt me during my presentation, if something is not very clear, you can do it, of course. It's not a problem for me to stop and try to improve my presentation to be more precise on what I'm trying to say. So today we are going to think in terms of the crisis, the international financial crisis. What did we learn? And going from there, what kind of reforms was being implemented? These reforms going in the right direction? Are they able to stop future crises? I'm sure you know already the answer, but I try to be also speaking about the future. What are the prospects for future regulation, future stability or instability? So I will have three parts in my presentation. One will be lessons. I think the major lessons we can draw from this crisis in terms of regulation. I will talk about the major reforms which have been implemented. I won't spend too much time on the reforms themselves, although I will stress some major points, because I suppose you know that, you know at least what's going on at the international level, for instance, but I will pinpoint a few aspects which seems to be very interesting or very critical, and then I will try to think in terms of perspective, which is a very difficult thing to do, is to try to see what's going to happen ahead. You'll see how I do it. Maybe you'll be surprised by the way I do it. Okay, so first, what did we learn about from the crisis, recent crisis? So I stress 5 points. Of course, there are many more points to be stressed, but I think these 5 points are very important and deserve some discussion. The first idea is that, in fact, and I think most economists today would agree with that, that we had, before the crisis, a kind of deficit of financial regulation. The other idea, which is more controversial, is that the Basel Committee regulations were presented a lot of limits and also perverse effects which can contribute to explain the crisis, according to me at least. I will also spend some time with respect to the role of central banks, because they are major actors today of international global finance, and their role has been increasing during the recent years. So today, where are we? Where do we stand in terms of the role of central banks? Here also there is a discussion, there is a debate, but people have been changing their mind very much in recent years with respect to the role of central bank. I will talk about a specific topic. Maybe some of you are not familiar with this concept. The question of the failure of banks and what we call the resolution of bank failure, which is something very, very important, was very important during the crisis. What shall we do when we have banks? Think of the case of Lehman Brothers, for instance, which are in trouble. What shall we do? Is it the role of taxpayers to pay for rescuing banks? Do we have to find other ways to do? So this is the type of question we need to think about. And the last point, which is also a very controversial topic, I don't know how it is in Brazil right now, because maybe you tell me, but I can tell you that in Europe, it's a very controversial issue. It's a question of the separation of retail banking and investment banking. So some economists, and I am among them, think that today we really need a separation, but a lot of other economists, and of course the bankers themselves, do not agree at all with this idea. So we'll talk about that. So first, this question of deficit of banking and financial regulation. Just before the crisis, let's say in the early year 2000, 2005, I would say that most orthodox economists would say there is enough, and maybe there is too much financial regulation. And of course today they don't say exactly the same thing, because they realize that what we said, orthodox economists or other people from the financial sector sometimes say that financial regulation was not enough and not adapted. And this may be one of the explanations of the crisis. In other words, if financial regulation had been more efficient, maybe the international crisis would not have happened. I'll just give you an example. I think that in the US, the authorities, and for instance, the Clinton administration in the late 90s did not eliminate all control of debt, of household debt, including low-income households. Maybe the subprime crisis would not have happened. Okay? So it was this deregulation and this lack of regulation of surveillance, supervision of debt, which was a real problem in the US. That maybe used to explain what happened in the US. In Europe, we had what we call the Larosière report. Jacques Larosière is well known because he was at the head of the French Central Bank before the ECB was created, the European Central Bank, but also he was at the head of the IMF for a while in the 90s. So he's fairly well known. He's a very liberal man, in fact. It's not at all orthodox and not at all interventionist, but he wrote a report in 2009. Mr. Barroso, who is also a very liberal person, who asked him to write a report about financial regulation in Europe, but also in the rest of the world. And he concluded that, in fact, the crisis can be explained partly, at least, by the fact that the financial and banking regulation was not sufficient, was not adapted. And this is interesting to see liberal people change their mind, saying, well, we went too far in terms of deregulation. And that's interesting. Now, today, of course, for us, it's obvious to say that, but it was not so obvious for orthodox economists to say that there is no invisible end in financial markets. Financial markets cannot stabilize themselves. They cannot create optimal situations for themselves, contrary to the orthodox theory. And on the contrary, the heterodox, let's say the Keynesian point of view, saying that markets and financial systems are fundamentally unstable, is a right view if you look at what happened. Okay? And if you agree with that, of course, then you think that we need strong regulation and we need important reforms in this field. So I think this was the first lesson, that today a lot of people who did not think the same way 10 years ago would think that really we need a stronger system of regulation. So this was I would say, the first lesson. The second lesson, which is maybe more controversial, but I think for me it's very important, is that I think the Basel Committee and the Basel scheme creates a lot of problems. Not only did it create problems in the past, but today, Basel III, the new Basel scheme, which is put into effect, will be put into effect in the coming years, is really creating new problems. I'm very, very severe myself, and I can tell you that this is not the case among all economists. Even among heterodox economists, we disagree with the role or the negative effect of the Basel Committee. So it's a point of discussion. Maybe you will react to my views. Well, there were at least 5 problems created by the Basel system, Basel scheme. One, and this is well known now, but it was not the case a few years ago, it creates what we call pro-cyclical effects. Banks and financial systems are pro-cyclical by themselves. Minsky showed that very well, for instance. Why is the Basel system pro-cyclical? Well, because by the fact that it's creating a lot of pressure on banks and making them more sensitive to risks, then banks will stop lending when we have downturn in the business cycles. And on the contrary, when things are going well, and the pressure of regulation is weakening, then they would lend a lot to the economy, so they would boost the economy. So we know very well today that, and you have some econometric work which has been done in the past, which shows very well that the Basel requirement ratios, for instance, the Cook ratio, the capital requirement ratio, has a pro-cyclical effect. So this is a problem in terms of stability, because if you create prudential ratios like the capital ratio to stabilize the system, and if you find, in fact, these ratios have a pro-cyclical effect, then you think that it's a problem. You don't, your system is not, is counterproductive. The second idea is that the Basel Committee, Basel I, Basel II, the macro-prudential regulation did not exist completely, almost did not exist. So maybe some of you are not familiar with this concept of macro-prudential regulation as opposed to micro-prudential regulation. What does it mean? In fact, the people working and making rules at the Basel Committee, by the way, who are these people? Basically, they are central bankers who meet at the Basel Committee and decide upon financial and prudential regulation. They made a big mistake, which is linked to the theoretical background they had in mind. They thought that it was enough, it was sufficient to regulate individual banks through prudential ratios, like the capital requirement ratio, to have the stability of the whole system. Okay? In other words, if individual bankers, individual actors are correctly regulated, then the whole system should be stable. For me, this is linked to the background, the theoretical background of the efficient market hypothesis, which is let's say, the neoliberal type of paradigm, saying that what's important is individual actors. If individual actors behave well, then the whole system should be stable by itself, should work well. And this is completely wrong, of course. And this is one major flaw of the neoclassical, as you know, theory, is that it does not understand, people do not understand that there is a huge difference between what's happening at the micro level and what's happening also at the macro level. Okay? So, the Basel Committee did not work, did not think in terms of macro-prudential regulation. In other words, what are the conditions for the stability of the whole system, and what should be the rules for that stability to be there. Okay? The third point is this question of bank liquidity. The subprime crisis showed us very clearly that it is not enough to have good capital ratios for the banks to be in good situation. It's also required to have a good liquidity position. And very interesting work, by the way, for those of you who are interested in this topic, has been done at the BIS, the Bank of International Settlements. By the way, I think this is the place maybe where you find the best economists, international economists, in terms of financial regulation. And here you have people post-Keynesian people who are doing a very, very good job. For instance, I'm thinking of Borio, I don't know if you know him. You can go on the website of the BIS and you'll find very interesting papers by him and his team. And I think he's at the head of the research department in BIS. And he made very good papers on this question of liquidity, bank liquidity, showing very clearly that the Basel Committee and other regulators totally underestimated the importance of bank liquidity. Why? Because when there is a crisis, and when the expectations are becoming very, very pessimistic, it's clearly on the liquidity side and on the interbank market that things happen. In other words, banks stop lending to each other because they don't trust each other. And then the whole system is stopped. And then this is why central bank has to intervene as a last resort to bring liquidity, otherwise the system breaks down. And it's very interesting and very surprising to see that the Basel Committee didn't take into account this kind of problem. So, as we'll see later on, the new regulations introduced 2 new liquidity ratios that the bank has to respect. The fourth point, which is also very controversial, is that the idea that I firmly believe in is that it seems to me that the Basel Committee put too much emphasis, gives too much importance to capital ratios to regulate banks. In fact, as you know, I suppose, when the Basel Committee started in the 1970s, the main thing it did was to implement capital ratio for banks. And all along this period, from the 70s up to now, practically, you could say that the main mode of regulation was capital ratio. And for me, this is extremely dangerous. At least there are 1 or 2 major drawbacks for this regulation. One is the following. If you ask banks to have high level of own funds, of capital, it means that banks are very dependent on financial markets to raise these funds. Okay? And hence the pressure on the markets on banks, the pressure of shareholders on banks will be very, very high. This explains why banks need higher and higher level of capital return, because they want to attract new shareholders to improve the capital ratio. So there is a contradiction there by saying one way to have stable banks is to have them hold high level of capital ratio, and at the same time putting banks under the pressure of financial markets. So here, for me, there is I would say, internal contradiction here with respect to the Basel Committee system. Another reason why I'm very much critical about this business of capital ratios is the following. And we talked about that yesterday in my presentation, maybe some of you were here. It's the question, the idea is the following. If you impose very strict capital requirements on banks, what are they going to do? They are going to try to escape from these requirements. How will they escape? Bankers are very clever people usually. They will create new products, they will make financial innovations to get rid or to get around this regulation. What are these financial innovations? The most important one is securitization. According to me, one of the major reasons why securitization has been developing so quickly and took such a large place in the huge financial system today is because of the Basel Committee regulations. It's one way the bank found to circumvent, to escape from this kind of regulation. And the shadow banking system, for instance, which is not part of the world financial system, which exists outside the regulation of the Basel Committee, precisely has been developing very much because of this regulation. So you see there is another perverse effect of the Basel regulation is that it pushed the bank to escape from regulation and to develop new activities outside regulation, which was at the heart of the crisis. Because we know very well today that one of the major places where the crisis took place
the financial crisis is precisely the shadow banking system. So you see here there is a huge contradiction about the way the Basel Committee regulation works. And I'm very, very surprised to see that among professional regulation bodies, but also among economists, people don't stress too much this dimension. And even among heterodox economists, I have many colleagues with whom I usually agree on many topics, but on this topic we do not agree. Most, you would find a lot of heterodox economists who think that increasing the level of capital ratio is a very, very good idea, and that we should go further instead of having, let's say, between 8 and 10% of the risk. Today, some heterodox economists would think that 25% would be a good idea. And I think it's a complete mistake, because it creates a problem I just mentioned. So here there is a point of disagreement, of debate, that maybe some of you won't agree with my position, but I think really there is a big problem. And the last point is that the Basel Committee, but not only the Basel Committee, the national authorities, the regulatory body in the US, in Europe, in some other country, I guess in Brazil it's maybe the case too, focus too much on banks, strictly speaking, for regulation, and do not look outside banks, of what we call quasi-banks. In other words, financial institutions, which are doing operations which are not very far from banking operations, but still are outside the banking system, strictly speaking. And today, one of the problems is that the perimeter, in other words, the sphere which is regulated is too restricted. It's not wide enough, and this explains why a lot of financial actors, which are very close to banks, escape from regulation. So here there is a problem, and the Basel Committee is having this type of problem. So this is what I think about the Basel Committee. So you see I'm fairly severe about the Basel Committee, but I think it's a real problem. Now, what about central bank? Here also we have a very interesting topic. As I mentioned previously, the central banks are today very, very, very important actors in the financial system. Maybe they are the most powerful actors, to some extent, in today's global finance. Okay? So we have to look at the central bank, what they do, what they should do, what they should not do, and so on. It's a real problem, and it's a very important issue. And I think for some of you are looking for doctoral dissertation topics, here you have a lot of very interesting topics dealing with central banking, by the way. So, just to mention, to start from the beginning, before the crisis, we had a dominant view, which is called the New Keynesian Consensus, okay? That central banks should do what they call inflation targeting. Your central bank in Brazil was doing that. The central bank in Europe, ECB, was doing the same. The Federal Reserve, the Bank of Canada, the Bank of Australia, all major central banks, the Bank of England, were doing this type of inflation targeting. The idea being that if you have a good inflation targeting, you have influence on inflation expectations, and that's enough to curb down inflation. So I think this is completely, not completely, but grown to a large extent, because that's not enough to reduce inflation today in our society. Why? Because they have a very restricted, central bank used to have a very restricted, narrow definition of inflation. They were looking only at inflation of goods and services. And for instance, they did not care of inflation on financial markets, because financial inflation also is something which is very important. The inflation of price of financial assets, for instance, is something which has a strong influence not only on markets, but also on the real sector of the economy. It has influence on the behavior of households, it has an influence on the behavior of business firms. So banks have a very narrow and very restrictive view of what they should do. Besides that, there was a dogma which was the following. Central bank should care only about monetary stability, that is basically inflation, or eventually exchange rates, which is external monetary stability. but they should not take care of financial stability. This is what was called the separation principle. Okay? In other words, it's not the job, this was the view, the conventional wisdom before the crisis. It's not the role of banks to take care of financial stability. It's the job of regulatory bodies, of authorities in charge of that, like the Basel Committee or other institutions. Okay? This was a very deeply rooted belief in most central bankers. For instance, I remember that we had a debate with Jean-Claude Trichet. Jean-Claude Trichet was, as you may know, the French man at the head of the ECB before Mario Draghi. And this guy is to some extent very narrow-minded person. Not only because he's French, but also because sometimes he has a very monetarist approach, a very, very strong view, very narrow view. He was thinking that central banks should care only about inflation and nothing else, and that's the job of the central bank. He did not realize that you cannot separate the two. In fact, in the real world, monetary stability and financial stability go together. They interact very much. Okay. For instance, there are some paradox. What is called I don't know if you are aware of that, the credibility paradox. It has been shown by Borio, the man I mentioned in the BIS, very well, that if central bank is doing a very good job, apparently in terms of monetary stability, expectations are very optimistic, and this is what we call also the tranquility paradox of Minsky, which is coming. This is when business actors, but also financial actors, are taking risk. Okay, it's when everything is quiet, the risk should seem to be very low because the central bank seems to do a good job. Then this is where risks are being taken. And I don't know if you recall that before the crisis, the subprime crisis, there was what they call the Great Moderation period. They call that the Great Moderation. The Great Moderation was about 10 years period, very short period, 10 years, during which we had low inflation in the world, high rate of growth on the average, everything was doing well. And this, in the Minskian approach, this is exactly the time where actors are taking risks because they are so confident in the future that they think they can take a lot of risk, and this is what happened. In other words, you can see that the subprime crisis being an endogenous result of the Great Moderation itself maybe partly caused by the central bank policies, which were looking only at inflation and not at all what was going on in the financial sphere or on the real estate sector, where there was a bubble in many countries, like the US, like Spain, like Ireland, like the UK. So this separation was very, very, very bad thing, because in the mind of central bankers, they didn't want to look at what's going on in the financial sphere, and this is why we had this big type of problem. And I think the Minskian approach on this respect is very, very interesting. So today, central bankers changed their mind. Mario Draghi, Bernanke, when he was at the head of the Federal Reserve, clearly said that central bank must care about financial stability. It's their role to look after that with other actors, of course, but the central bank should take care about this question of financial stability, along with this question of monetary stability. Okay, and this is a progress, I think, in the mind of most people now today. This separation principle was abolished with respect to central banking. That's a progress. So, for the time being, this is what I'd like to say. But I'd like to say a few other words about central banking. As you know, we learned that the first year of university, one of the major functions of central bank is the function of lender of last resort. Here again, there was a very interesting debate on what is this role of lender of last resort. And here you have 2 points of view, 2 opposite points of view. According to the very orthodox people, lender of last resort is only the function of central bank consisting in helping banks which are in trouble when the liquidity in the money market is going down. Okay? So, in other words, the central bank is helping banks, but only banks. Okay? This was the vision defended by Milton Friedman, for instance, monetarist people. Okay? Central bank should care only of banks, that's all. But today, thanks to the crisis, we learned that central bank and the function of lender of last resort is broader than that. Central bank not only has to take care of the banking system, that's liquidity, but they have to take care of the liquidity and the functioning of the financial market. And among the financial markets, one segment of financial market is very, very important in today's society, is the public bond market, okay? Government bond market. Why public bond and government bond are so important in today's capitalism, today's financial system? Because they are supposed to be the asset, the risk-free asset. And for instance, the interest rate structure or the holding of banks of many other actors are very much founded on this, on the role of public bond. Public bond is held by many actors and is a very important asset in the economy. So if the central bank does not care about the stability of the public bond market, then the whole monetary, banking and financial system will be in trouble. Okay? And I think one economist, one central banker, who is not really an heterodox, but did a very good job in this respect, is Bernanke. Okay? By the way, you know that Bernanke, who was at the head of the Federal Reserve, wrote his dissertation about the Great Depression in the US in the 90s, in the 30s, okay? And I think this guy has been thinking a lot about what's happening when you have a big stress on financial markets. And he was very quick when the crisis happened in 2007 or 2008 to react and to see that the Federal Reserve be very active on the public bond market, buying bonds or selling bonds to stabilize interest rates and to put a downward pressure on the public bond interest rate so that to reduce the cost of public debt. So this was fairly efficient. Unfortunately, on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, in Europe, the ECB did not learn the lesson as quickly as the Fed did. In other words, Mr. Trichet, and even today to some extent, Mr. Draghi, did not go as far as to be very active on the public bond market so that to reduce the pressure on government and to stabilize the financial bond market, the government bond market. It is true that in Europe we have a political context which is quite different from what it is here, I would say, or what it is in the US. We have a very orthodox pressure by Germany to have the central bank play a minimum role in terms of rescuing governments. Why? The idea that in Europe there is no bailout of government by the central bank or by other governments, okay? Because I would say for moral hazard reasons. If governments know that the central bank will come and buy the debt and reduce the interest rate on that debt, they will not reduce that deficit and the debt will go up and up and up. Okay? This is the view, the orthodox view, which is held in Europe. And Mr. Draghi, I don't know what he thinks himself, but the way he behaves is clearly to limit the intervention of the ECB on the government bond market for this reason, which is not the case in the UK, by the way, which is not the case in the US, and I guess in other countries like Japan also. So here we have this big debate. You see, all central banks do not behave in the same way, and it's a matter of discussion, and I think it's very interesting. For me, and I think for most heterodox economists today, we clearly are in favor of, for a broad view of the lender of last resort function, including intervention of the central bank on financial markets, and in particular in government bond markets. Okay, so this is my view, but I agree that this view that we should broaden the role of central banks raise problems. And here I mentioned three problems which are not that obvious to solve. The first one is that if you say to central banks, you should take care of monetary stability, let's say inflation, but you should take care also of financial stability and banking stability. You have more than one objective, more than one goal, and for the time being, central banks have only one instrument, basically, interest rates. So there is three objectives, or two objectives for one instrument. There is determination, okay? And there is what we will call the conflict of objectives. In other words, if at some point we have inflation, but also you have to rescue the banking system, what do? Do we favor the rescuing of central bank and then you create liquidity and you may push up inflation? Okay, what do you choose? Okay, this problem of priority can be solved if you create new instruments for central bank for them to react. And for instance, I participated in a study in France about central banking, not only in Europe but in other central banks, and we proposed new instruments for central bank. For instance, among the instruments central bank would be using, which they don't, and I think in Brazil this does not exist either, is to create, for instance, compulsory reserve on credit, on bank credit, bank loans, so that you could act on the ability of bank to increase or to develop lending to the economy. If you think that at some point there is a risk of more inflation or risk of a financial bubble or real estate bubble because bank credit is developing too much, then you raise the rate of compulsory reserve, and this can be done in a very selective way. You can do it on some sectors of the economy, not all sectors. You can do it for some countries, not all countries. And we think it's a very important idea to have new instruments for central bank. So this is an example. Maybe it's not the best instrument to create, but central bankers really now need to have more instruments because they have more goals, more than one goal. Inflation targeting is one thing, monetary stability is one thing, but we only know that central banks should take care of financial stability, should take care of banking stability, and so on. Now, there is another job, another problem, which is a very traditional problem. It was raised in the 60s by economists like even Tinbergen, for instance. By the way, the guy who got the first Nobel Prize, I think. Tinbergen raised the problem what we call optimal policy mix. And he said, well, in our society, we have two major macroeconomic policies, two macroeconomic tools. One is monetary policy, the second one is fiscal policy. The question of how you combine the two so that they are efficient. Okay? And he put forward a few rules, and maybe you learned that in your textbook in the past, but it is very interesting. But today we have again this problem, because according to monetarist orthodoxy, the central banks are independent and they should not take care of what's going on in the fiscal policy sphere. Okay? They should only take care of monetary policy, no coordination whatsoever with respect to between fiscal and monetary policy. I think this is a big mistake. I think we should go back to the previous framework, which was the Keynesian framework, even neo-Keynesian framework, what was not a very revolutionary framework, developed by people like Tinbergen, saying that we cannot ignore the two hands of the body, cannot ignore each other. You cannot make an action on one side, which is monetary policy, ignoring what's going on the other side, which is fiscal policy. So this problem is raised in all countries. In Europe, now we have this problem because, as you know, monetary policy is unique, is decided by the central bank, but fiscal policy is not unique. We have as many fiscal policies as you have as a number of states. Today, 28 states are making their own fiscal policy without any coordination. That's a huge problem. So I think central bank could play an interesting role in pushing government to coordinate themselves and to coordinate monetary and fiscal policy. Well, this is another second problem. And the third problem I'd like to raise is what we call the democratic issue. Giving a lot of functions, new functions to central banks creates a democratic problem. Why? Because banks, central banks are becoming very powerful since they have a major role now in our economy, in our society. This is inconsistent with the independence, the strict independence of central bank. In other words, the central bank, since they have a very important role, and we agree that they should play an important role, should be accountable. In other words, accountability is something extremely important. And they should be accountable not only to elected bodies, like parliaments, for instance, the European Parliament in Europe, or your parliament here in Brazil, or the Congress in the US, but they should be also accountable to the society as a whole, which means that we have to create institutions where we have to create institutions which would allow the civil society, that is bank users, bank customers, for instance, or wage earners, unions, to have a debate with the central bank, a public debate on what it's doing. Okay? Afterwards, the central bank can take a decision, but it has to take its decision after the public debate with the rest of society. Otherwise, it's very dangerous because there is no control, there is a total opacity of central banking, and it's very dangerous. So this democratic issue for us, for me, and I guess for you, I'm sure, is a very serious issue. I'd like to stress something to you about Europe. Why is it that the European crisis has been so deep in the Eurozone? And why is it that we still have a big problem to solve this crisis? And what should be the role in particular of central bank and government in this respect? Myself, I think that we can qualify, present the Eurozone crisis as a twin crisis. I'm sure you are familiar with this concept of twin crisis, which was used in the 90s to characterize the emerging market economies crisis. At that time, we were saying that there was a banking crisis going along with a currency, or if you want, exchange rate crisis. In most emerging countries, not so much in Brazil, by the way, but let's say in the Asian countries like Thailand, Malaysia, Korea, and so on. Okay? Well, in Europe now we have also a twin crisis, but the twin crisis is different. It's a crisis where you have a vicious cycle going on, and involving, on one side, the banking crisis, which I mentioned, but also the sovereign debt crisis. And they are interrelated, and they create a vicious cycle which is very dangerous. Why? Well, look what happened. In 2009, starting in 2009, few European countries, Greece to start with, but also after Ireland, and then Portugal, and then Spain, okay, got into trouble because they had a very high level of debt. Government had to rescue them right away because central bank, of course, was putting liquidity in the banking system, but that was not enough. So government has to rescue them and to inject funds, capital in banks. This was most spectacular in a country like Ireland. In Ireland, for instance, the level of debt, this is approximate, was about 20% of GDP before the crisis, and a few years later, in 2010, it was about 90% of GDP. Why? Only because the government in Ireland had to rescue banks. So this created a very dramatic situation, because banks were in trouble, they had to be rescued by government. The government has a debt which wanted very up, and then there was a speculative attacks on the government debt of this, on the public debt of these governments, okay? Irish government, Greek governments, Portuguese government. They had to fight, and they were in trouble, okay, because of the banks. And the banks themselves were in trouble because since they were holding a lot of public bonds as supposedly asset-free assets, or risk-free assets, okay, they were having a lot of problems with their own activity. So this is how we had this vicious circle, which is represented here by this diagram. And what is important here is that in yellow, I mentioned that the ECB, this is what I was saying before, didn't play completely his role of lender of last resort at that time, intervening in the government market to help countries like Ireland, Greece, Portugal, which were in deep trouble. Okay? And if the central bank had intervened at that time to doing like was done in the US or even in the UK, I think the Eurozone crisis would not have been as important. Okay? So the orthodox dogma of the ECB not intervening on the government market for moral hazard reason is a very dangerous dogma, but which is still having today. So this is why we have this big vicious circle, and we have to break this circle. And I will mention in a moment one way we found in Europe to break this circle, but for me it's not enough. There is still a big problem today. We still are in crisis. The Eurozone crisis is really having big problems today because of this vicious circle, this twin crisis. Okay? I hope it's clear enough. But maybe we'll come back to that if you want me to be more specific. Okay, now there is a fourth lesson that we learn, and here I would say that there is a kind of consensus among economists, orthodox, heterodox, to some extent, among professionals, among authorities, that we did not take account in the past enough about the question of bank failure. A bank is not a firm like the other firm, like any other business firm. Why? When a business firm, even if it's a big one, go into failure, very often it doesn't have an impact on the rest of the economy. It does not have what we call a systemic impact on the economy. Okay? Whereas in the banking system, if a bank, even if it's not a large bank, gets into trouble, it may put into trouble the rest of the banking system. Okay. In particular because banks are very much interconnected. Okay. And not only is the banking system may be in trouble as a whole, because of the systemic risk, but the whole economy may get into trouble because banks stop lending because they are in trouble themselves. So this question of bank failure is a very, very, very important question, which was underestimated by most economists, theoreticians, academics, but also professionals before the crisis. So now we understand a few things. First, we are in a world where in most countries, and I think it's a case in Brazil, it's a case in France, for instance, where we have very, very, very large banks which are too big to fail. Okay. In other words, if one of these banks gets into trouble, the whole banking system is in trouble. Okay. The second thing is that the bailout of banks, that is the fact of rescuing banks, is very dangerous because it has a negative effect I just mentioned. Moral hazard problems, risks taken by banks if they know that they are going to be rescued by the government, but also if the banks are rescued by governments, this puts a problem on government deficits and so on. So it's a very dangerous and very important matter. So the two major conclusions which have been drawn by a lot of people in the aftermath of the crisis, and here there is quite an agreement among a lot of people on that. One is the idea that the resolution of bank failures should be solved by very specific procedures which would reduce the impact of such bank failure. I don't know if you are aware of one of them because it's very something new, but it's very a lot of people people have been talking about that, is what they call the living wills. The living wills, what is it? What is it? It's the idea that authorities will ask to all banks, before they get into trouble, to tell them what they will do in case of problems. What assets are they going to sell? What type of resources are they going to increase? Are they going to issue bonds? Are they going to borrow from specific type of actors? What they will do in case of problems. This means that the authorities know in advance what will happen in case a bank gets into trouble. And this is called the living will. Another thing which was debated very much is the bank taxation. If we don't want to bail out banks, if we don't want taxpayers to pay too much for banks, why don't we raise a specific tax on banks, okay, which will be used to finance an international fund, okay, which could be used in case banks get into trouble. In other words, if a bank gets into trouble, this fund, specific fund, will be used, and not the government budget, not the government deficit will not increase. Okay, so the idea is to create a disconnection between bank problems, bank failures on one side, and government deficit, government finance, okay? which was one of the problems we had in Europe, as I mentioned. Okay, disconnect bank problems from government problems. And this is a very interesting also approach, I think, progress. Okay? In other words, today, all economists, progressive or conservative economists, I would say, would think that we should avoid bail-out type of approach to rescue banks, but instead having bail-in approach, having shareholders, having creditors of banks pay to rescue their own banks in case of problem. Okay? And this is something that now is where we have a big progress in the let's say the thinking of most people. Okay? Now, the last point, last lesson we learned, and which is also a case of big debate, is the question of universal banking. Here I would compare the US and Europe, if you accept. I know that Brazil is maybe in the middle, in between. In the US, they have the Glass-Steagall Act in the 1930s, which forbidden bank, decided that bank wouldn't be at the same time a retail bank and investment bank. It was demonstrated by economists, and some of them are very orthodox economists, like Rogoff, for instance, in publishing papers on that, showing clearly that in the US, this Glass-Steagall Act played a very important role for the stability of the banking system in the US. During the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the banking in the US were fairly stable. No banking crisis, almost no banking crisis. Some empirical work has been done which shows, I think it's fairly convincing, that the Glass-Steagall Act played a very important role. In Europe, it's the contrary, it's quite different. In Europe, the philosophy of our authorities is to propose universal bank as the best model for banks. Universal bank means banks can be at the same time investment bank, retail bank. Now there is a big debate, of course. The business sector, that is the banking lobby, try to demonstrate that universal banks are the strongest bank. They behave very well because they can make money on different activities. They are very well diversified. Hence, this is the model we have to have. And among the other side, I would say, of the economists, and I think we are a minority, in fact, that's a problem, of economists thinking that the separation of banking, investment banking and retail banking is very important to bring back stability in the banking system. Why? Just to give you an example, I think that investment banks is a business where speculation takes a very important role. Okay. High level of return obtained through speculative behavior. And these investment banks, when they are in the same institution that retail bank, are using deposits, okay, of their customers. So they are taking risk with the money of you and me, regular depositor who do not know about it at all. So it's a very risky situation. So this is one reason among others why I think we have to clarify the situation and to say investment banks should not use the resources, the popular resources, I would say, that is the deposits of most people in the country. Okay. So this is why I think separation should be implemented. But unfortunately, today, in most countries, the majority of regulators, supervisors, politicians, academics are, at least in Europe, and in France in particular, are still in favor of the universal model of banking. Okay? So there is a debate today. So I don't know how it is in Brazil if you have that kind of debate, because I do think that you have universal banks also. If you have in one country at the same time universal banks and specialized banks, if the whole system is not universal bank, it may be the case that you can accept that. And this is what's happening, for instance, in Germany. Germany is quite different from France in this respect. And I guess in Brazil it would be like Germany to some extent. You have at the same time universal bank, but also specialized bank. In France, it's completely different. We have 4 banks, huge banks like BNP Paribas, Société Générale, I'm sure you know them because they are everywhere in the world. These banks are controlling 90% of the business of banking sector, okay, and they are universal banks. We have only universal banks, and this is a big problem. So we don't have a diversified banking sector with having small banks, big banks, universal banks, specialized banks, public banks, like you have in Brazil, going along with private banks. We don't have that in France at all. We are only private universal bank, and this is extremely dangerous. Okay? And we have a debate. So far, the lobby, the banking lobby is so powerful that they convinced the government not to change the rules. By the way, the French government, supposed to be a socialist government, had a law which was passed last year called the Separation Law on banking. So the title of the bank is the Separation Law, but it did almost nothing to separate banks. It's a trick, in fact, so to show that today there is still a problem. Now, I'll go faster on the second part of my presentation because I suppose that some of the things I'm going to talk about you know already. There is a paradox today. It is true that in the aftermath of the crisis, we had a lot of financial reforms. We cannot deny that most countries in the world decided to make reforms. Here I give you 3 examples of very, very important reforms, at least apparently important. One, I mentioned before already, the Basel III reform is a very, very important reform. Many changes have been implemented. I will come back to that in a moment. So this is an important reform. Another example, I'm sure you heard about it, is the Dodd-Frank Act in the US, which was voted in 2010 by the Obama administration during his first term. Okay? If you look at the Dodd-Frank Act, it's a very ambitious law. I won't have time to present it unless you have questions afterward. But if you read papers on the Dodd-Frank Act, it is something supposed to be very ambitious. Okay? The third reform in Europe, which is very recent, it was decided last year, is what we call now the European Banking Union, which I will present quickly. If you look at these 3 examples, this is the proof, maybe, many people, for the public opinion, let's say for the citizens, that different parts of the world, in the US, in Europe, at the international level with the Basel Committee, there have been very, very ambitious reforms. But the paradox, as I will show in a moment, that these apparently ambitious reform, in fact, are very weak reform. They don't go very far, contrary to their appearances. Okay? This is what I want to show to you, because for me, here there is something which is apparently paradoxical. For instance, if you look at the Basel III reform, the Basel III committee tried to answer, to tackle some of the problems I mentioned before. For instance, procyclicity problem. Well, in the new ratio, capital ratio, now they have what they call a contra-cyclical buffer, okay, which is moving contra-cyclically to reduce the procyclicity, I'm sorry, it's a bit technical, of the capital ratio. So they've done a job in this direction. This is positive. Second, I mentioned that the Basel committee ignored the liquidity problems of banks. Well, now we have two new liquidity ratios which are going to put pressure on banks to respect liquidity requirements. This is a progress, this is obvious. But, as I mentioned, so I won't stay long on that, the problem is that the philosophy, the general philosophy of the Basel Committee did not change. In particular, the major instrument of prudential supervision is still the capital requirement ratio, which is now higher than it used to be. And for me, it has negative effect, which I mentioned already to you. So I think they did not learn the lesson that, in fact, the capital requirement ratio, the way it works, was one of the causes of the crisis. When you write that, because I wrote papers on that, they disagree completely with you. They say it's a second order problem. Then we may have perverse effect, counterproductive effect of the capital requirement ratio, but it's not important. And I think they are completely wrong. It's very, very important. So here there is a big disagreement. For me, the Basel III reform doesn't go in the right direction with respect to this question of capital ratio. Now, a few words about the European Union, because banking union, because I guess something new and we don't know too much about it, but this is to show you that it goes in the right direction to some extent, but in fact it's going to be a very weak reform, according to me, which will not solve the major problems of the European banking system. Okay? It goes in the right direction. The second idea is that we create a European-wide insurance deposits. This is very good because now all depositors in Europe are protected in good condition. Also, this is good for the confidence that depositors may have in the banking system. Third, we decided in Europe to have a unified, very comprehensive resolution system for bank failures. This is also very interesting, very good. But, in fact, when you look in the details, in French we have this word, I don't know how you would translate that. The devil is in the details. I suppose you know that also, this expression. If you look in the detail of the reform, it doesn't go very far. For instance, the ECB is only responsible for the supervision of large banks. But what about the medium and small-sized banks, which are very good number of them, not in France, but in Germany, in Spain, in Italy. And in fact, you know why this was decided? It's because the German, Mrs. Merkel, didn't want that the ECB look at their banks. Okay? Because we know that in Germany, a lot of small banks are in big trouble now. Okay? Private or public banks. So, we know also that sometimes small banks, if they are in trouble, can put into trouble all the banks, even if they are very small. So, here there is a problem. But this is one of the details we saw. This question of resolution. European people disagree very much, as it is often the case, about this idea of what happens if, for instance, Spanish banks get into trouble. Is it the case that the German taxpayer maybe asked to pay for the Spanish bank, which got into trouble? If this is the case, well, the Germans said no. So we decided that there is no real bail-in the banks, but that the bail-out also will not work. Okay, so here's something which is missing. There is a missing link in this disposition. So we have something which is nice when you look at it, and people say, "Oh, wow, what a big progress." And when you look in the detail, you see that it's not completely satisfactory. Okay, so I will end up with one problem. Maybe you understand that very easily. There is an ambiguity about the banking union, about the role in particular of the ECB. Is the authority of the ECB going to be only on banks in the Eurozone, that is 18 countries, excluding the UK, which is, as you know, in the Eurozone? Or will the ECB be able to act and to decide some measures which will be applied to the British banks? The British banks said no. Okay, Mr. Calderon said no, and I think he's right. It's not in the Eurozone. So there is an ambiguity here. The ECB, in fact, will be the single supervisor, but only in the banks of the Eurozone, excluding some of the major banks in the city in London, which is a major financial center in Europe. So here is another problem which has not been solved so far. So, just to tell you that we try to do our best in Europe. The authorities are working hard, but in fact there are many, many problems which are not being solved, which they think that if tomorrow we have another banking crisis starting in one of the country members, let's say Spain, the problem will be as difficult to solve as it was in the past years. So I don't think this new system solves the problem. And to end up with that, there is this question of separation. No decision has been taken at the European level on what is the optimal model of banks. Is the universal banking model the model which should be advocated, which should be proposed to the banks? And we have a very interesting document. You may read, it's very easy to get hold of this document, which is called the Liikanen Report, which gives some answers about that, but very weak answers. In other words, basically it says the universal banking model has to be maintained in Europe. And I think it's a big mistake. Of course, this is my view, not all economists agree. Now, I have to go faster, I'm sorry. A few words, or maybe last word, I would like to spend about the future of financial regulation. Okay. My view is that the ongoing reform, although they look very ambitious, are in fact weak. Hence, the future of financial regulation in the world, not only at the European level, in the world, is very uncertain. One of the major problems which is today faced by authorities and regulators is the role of the lobbies, banking and financial lobbies. They are extremely powerful in Washington, in Brussels, in major part, and I'm sure here, in Brasilia. Because these are so powerful that even if you have a very nice law, very nice proposal made by the government to improve financial regulation, as I said in the title that I proposed for my presentation, there are a few sips between the cup and the lip, Balzac, which is an expression used by Keynes, which you know, saying by that it's not because you have very interesting proposal, very ambitious proposal, that this will lead to very real reform, important reform. And I think this is a problem for the future. Okay? So one way to try to understand or to think of what is going to happen in the future is to use a method which we call the method of scenario, to make different possibilities, to think about different possibilities. In fact, I've been part of a team which made a report for the European Commission 2 years ago on this question of financial regulation and more broadly speaking on regulation in Europe in the future. So I'm going to draw on this, the result of this report we made. In fact, if you want to understand what will happen and what's happening already today, in terms of regulation, you have to look at the actors first, which are playing in the field of financial regulation. These actors can be banks. You have also public actors like governments, central banks, authorities, and also, and we should not forget them, the civil society, which is playing a very important role, but among civil society, at least the way it is defined by the European authorities, you have two types of members of civil society. You have the lobbyists, and you have social movements, which are not exactly the same, okay? But that's the way it is presented. Another question which is very important is the geography of finance in the future. Where will finance take place? In the past, it was London, New York. Okay, today we think that the world is going to become more polycentrical, and we will have more than one, more than two, more than three financial centers. For instance, what about Asia? Is going to play a very important role. We talk a lot about Hong Kong these days for democratic reasons, but Hong Kong is a very powerful financial center. So some people say that we are going to go toward what we call Hong Kong, a system of three major financial centers: New York, London, Hong Kong. But I think that won't be the case because we will have other financial centers. For instance, in the Middle East, with oil-producing countries, okay, and I guess in Latin America, what about Sao Paulo? Would be a very important financial center in the future. So this financial center would grow up. They would be in network, powerful network, and they may have a very important role in the way finance is going to work in the future. Okay. Now, there is also this problem, which is for us economists and for regulators very important, is the problem of the link between regulation and financial innovation. As I mentioned before, most financial innovations are made to get around, to avoid regulation. So, in the future, like it was the case in the past, we are going to have financial actors which will try to avoid as much as they can financial regulation. And there is a kind of race between financial regulation, financial regulators, financial actors, to improve the regulation of the system. And it's a very difficult situation, very tricky situation. And we have what we call the regulatory arbitrage behavior on the part of financial actors, which consists in avoiding regulation and going in the place of the world where the regulation is the weakest. Okay? So this is one of the major problems, I think, for the future. Now, another way to put things to understand what will happen in the future is that we can say that financial authorities have two major goals, or at least we have three major things that we have to look at to understand the future of finance and of financial regulation. The first thing is that we can say that financial regulation has a major goal, which is stability. But that's not the only goal of the financial regulation system. The other goal of authorities could be to be independent. In other words, to control their own banks, to control their own financial center, and to avoid to be on the dependency of other centers. For instance, in Brazil, I'm sure that your authorities want to limit the influence of the US policies on the Brazilian financial sector. So this question of independence is also very, very important. And the third idea, in particular among orthodox economists, is the idea that financial integration is the most desirable goal. In other words, they dream of a world where they would have only one space, one international global space for finance, with no frontiers between the countries, because this is the way finance is going to be the most efficient. Capital will get people to go from one place to the other, going to the place where it is the more efficient. Of course, this is not our view, I suppose, here, but a lot of economists think that this is what should be the goal of financial authorities. So if you admit that we have these three goals, then there is this idea put forward by Mundell, I'm sure you know about that, this trilogy, impossible trilogy, showing that it's impossible to have the three goals at the same time. You have the goal 2 by 2, for instance, you can have stability, financial stability and independence, but then if you have that, you have no financial integration, and so on. So, building on that, we have made scenarios, which are the following. I'm going fast, but it's easy, I think, to understand. For instance, if you want to have financial stability and independence of regulatory policy, if the government want to control their own system, then you have what we call a fragmentation scenario. The world is going to be fragmented in the future. Okay? If you combine financial stability and financial integration, then you may have what we call, and which is the most optimistic scenario, I will show it in a moment, you will have a system where you have a multipolar scenario. Countries are going to cooperate and to try to make the whole global financial system work in a satisfactory way. And then, if you combine 2 and 3, where there is interdependence and financial integration, you have what we call consolidation. I will show in the next moment what we mean by that. But, in fact, in our work, prospective work, we thought that the Mundell rule could be alleviated to some extent. In other words, we could make a compromise having the 3 goals, but at least partly achieved. And we call that the regional scenario. And I show to you that this scenario is very interesting, in particular for Latin America. I think this may be an interesting scenario for the future, as it is also for European people. Fragmentation is a situation where governments want to control their own system, okay, but also achieve stability. So in such a system, I won't comment on the detail because the time is running by, and you will have my PowerPoint presentation if you want, so you will look at it easily. But the idea is that we will have a country-specific regulation, no coordination, a strong heterogeneity in regulation in the world. So the result, for instance, for stability is that you may have stability within countries because you have a strong national regulation, but not at the international level, okay? Because countries do not cooperate, so you may have strong instability, for instance, for exchange rate between countries, because exchange rate is a variable which is a link between different countries. So this is a scenario which is fairly dangerous, but it may happen. It depends on the behavior of governments. The most optimistic scenario is what we call the multipolar scenario, where governments decide to abandon their control on their own banks, their own financial system, decide to cooperate at the international level, create new supranational authorities, for instance, an international body to control finance, okay? And also civil society plays a role, large NGOs interfere also with the decision by governments and by firms. And in this system, of course, which is very optimistic, utopian to some extent, it's a system where you have better stability at the international level. This is the dream. This is, for instance, the dream by Keynes with the Bancor system and the international monetary system that he dreamed about, where government would respect some rules, would respect the idea of cooperating, and that the big countries will not dominate completely the small countries, and so on. So, of course, this is a very optimistic scenario, and I don't think it's very likely today, unfortunately. One of the most likely scenarios, unfortunately, is what we call the consolidation scenario, where, in fact, big business, large funds, control completely the financial system. Okay, and the authorities cannot do much about it. Okay, and then we have regulation by government, which is very market friendly, which is very much in favor of business. Okay, and this is, of course, what all the banking system, banking actors want. They want to have freedom. They don't want to have regulation too strong, and so on. And according to us, this is the most pessimistic scenario in terms of stability, because we have in this system crisis from one time to the other, since regulation is very weak and as we know, financial actors don't care so much about stability problems. What they want is to improve the return and to have to speculate and to take risk. And in this context, of course, this scenario, which is likely in the near future, is not very optimistic. But the most interesting scenario, maybe for us, for Latin America, for Europe, is to think in terms of regionalization. The idea that maybe in the future, some parts of the world, like again Latin America and Europe, decide to get together and to cooperate to control better financial systems. Okay, and maybe this scenario will happen to some extent in some regions, not all. I would say that in Asia, or at least in East Asia, this may happen to some extent. And this is very interesting because if it's the case, then you may have stability in this region. At least crisis will be not as important as they used to be in the past. And here the big interrogation, this is why I put question mark, is what about the international level? Will this region cooperate together? Will the Latin America region cooperate with the European region, with the East Asian region? This we don't know. We may think that the cost of big global crises may be so important that they would decide to cooperate after such a crisis. There is a big crisis. They may decide to cooperate. We don't know. But this is an interesting scenario. It's not the most likely one. So, and I will conclude on that. For me, today, we are in a situation where there is a lot of uncertainty with respect to the future of regulation. In spite of the reforms which have been decided by governments in the US, in Europe, and other parts of the world. The most likely scenario is the most pessimistic one today. The fragmentation, each country tries to control its own system, and or let the business system, the business actors, the financial actors control the field. And then this is very interesting. But we know that in the future, political scheme may change. In other words, if we have a big crisis in some parts of the world, actors may decide to get together and to work in a more cooperative way. So this is very important. And for me, I am an activist, and I think that civil society has a very important role to play with respect to this question of future of regulation. In other words, if some social movements are getting together at the international level and try to convince the public opinion and some part of the elected body that regulation has to be strengthened and has to be built on a cooperative way, then we may have stability in the future. But this is, of course, a fairly optimistic view, of course. Fairly, maybe you won't be convinced that it will happen in the future. Okay, I'll stop here, and I'll be very happy to answer to your questions.
Professor, thank you for the speech. I would like to know if it's possible to put in these scenarios the currency hierarchy. How can we think the currency hierarchy of the hierarchy? Monetary.
Oh, okay.
How can we think the dollar and the context of the dollar in these scenarios?
Okay, sure. In fact, I went too fast because I was late in my presentation. But you can see that I tried to mention the IMS. IMS is the International Monetary System. Okay. So if you look at fragmentation, for instance, where each country tries to control its own financial system and do not want to have an international cooperation, well, then you have what we call currency competition. Okay? And then you would have financial and monetary instability. Okay? And the role of the dollar may remain very important because we don't see in this context, at least maybe we are wrong, other currencies becoming very important, as important as the dollar. Okay? So for a long time, the dollar would remain the dominant currency. But some emerging countries like China, the yuan, may play a growing role and try to compete with the dollar. We may have what we may call a duopoly system, where we will have the dollar and the yuan, but the dollar remaining more important than the yuan for a long time. Okay? So in this context, you have this speculation, you have no international reform, really, and we have also a process of what we call deglobalization. So this is a fragmentation ratio scenario. Now, if you look at the multipolar ratio, which is the most optimistic one, as I mentioned, look at what's happening at the IMS level, International Monetary System. Well, then you have the idea that we may have cooperation among countries with respect to the stability of exchange rates. Central bank will work together. For instance, you may have what they call the Williamson target zones. The idea that, and we had that in the past, in the 80s, where central bank will get together and decide what should be the correct level of exchange rates in the coming year. And then the central bank will act on the exchange rate market so as to bring their own currency rate to this target. Okay? This is a very interesting way of doing it. It has been done in the past, but today it's not the case any longer. Okay? But if we have increased cooperation, it could be the case. Now, of course, the best situation would be in this optimistic view to have this, the Keynes proposal with a Bangkok proposal. In other words, government will get together, decide that no national currency should play a role, international role. It should be a new currency created for this purpose, the Bangkok, for instance, and you would create an institution, the clearing union, which was proposed by Keynes, and then it would work in this way. So, of course, this is very optimistic. Now, the consolidation scenario, where you have a lot of competition and a lot of the private sector, the private banks and investors play a dominant role. In terms of the IMS, International Monetary System, you have a lot of instability because there is banks are trying to take advantage of the situation to speculate on the countries which are in trouble and so on. And so you may have debt crisis, currency crisis, and large banks will play a dominant role. And central bank will only accommodate, will only try to respond to the speculative attacks, but sometimes in a very unsuccessful way. So this is a very pessimistic way. And now, the last scenario of regionalization, you may have a quite different situation. You may have regional monetary zone, like we have the Eurozone. You may have Latin American currency, Sucre, I don't know, currency. You may have Asian currency unit, okay, which is decided in Asia, and so on. So this is interesting, and I think this is why I say this scenario maybe is the most interesting one, because it requires cooperation with the region. And the question which is raised then, would the different regions cooperate among them? Would it be cooperation among the regions? And that's the question. By the way, I mentioned something which is very popular in France and Europe, because a lot of my students are coming and say, I'd like to write a dissertation on Islamic finance. Okay, so I'm not sure it's very important, but will oil-producing countries in the Middle East play a major role in future finance, such that they would influence the financial system, the international financial system, and also, why not, create local or regional currency. Well, I don't think it's the case, but we have to think of this eventuality. Okay? So here, this idea of regional currency area may be interesting, because I would say that in 3 parts of the world today, of course Europe, but also Latin America, in Asia, there are some attempts to go toward a currency, regional currency area. Of course, here in Latin America it's not very well developed, but why not in the future? Maybe if there are some political leaders, some political movements, social movements really pushing for that, why not? And that would be a very interesting also situation. Good.
Hi, Professor. I was wondering when you said about Bernanke that he Bernanke when he acted quick about Bernanke when he acted quick when the crisis arrived.
Yeah.
And I was wondering because a couple of weeks ago, Professor Philippe Aristis gave his lecture in the same place here, and he was criticizing the quantitativism program. And I agree with him, but I think that in the very end, quantitativism may be creating another bubbles, asset bubbles. In the end, I would like to know your opinion about the quantitativism program and his stage now that I can't remember the name of the Fed chairman today, the woman, but she's trying to finish the quantitativism. Yeah, Janet Yellen, something like that. Yes, this is. Thank you.
Well, I agree that quantitative easing is very dangerous, but it is maybe less dangerous than the situation which we have in Europe. I look at the situation in Europe, which is much worse than it is in the US. Where central bank is very conservative and do not react very much. Whereas in the US, of course, by throwing a lot of liquidity from helicopter, as I say, using, you create a situation of too much liquidity, risk of bubbles, risk of inflation, and stability. But so far, I must say that if you look at what happened in the US, that did not happen. Okay? The US economy is not in very great shape, but it's growing again, creating employment. The level of unemployment is low, lowest historical low. Whereas in Europe, where we do not have any real quantitative easing, starting now a little bit only, we have a very high level of unemployment. We have risk of deflation and so on. So I think this is the first part of the answer. The second part of the answer, and for you, for Brazil, this is important, is that there is a problem with quantitative easing because it has a destabilizing effect on the part of the world, in particular with the carry trade business and so on. It has a strong impact on interest rates in the US, but then since the dollar is a international currency, it has a strong impact on other parts of the world, in Latin America, in Asia, and so on. So, and this business of benign neglect of the US authorities, which has always existed, to decide that we don't care what's happening in the future outside the US, our own business is inside the US, is a big problem, a big issue, and I understand that you are, as Latin American Brazilian people, very critical about the American policies. The third point is a very traditional point. It seems to me that today, at least in Europe, we reach the situation of what I would call the liquidity trap situation. In other words, now monetary policy has done as much as it can to help banks, to help the economy, taking risk of bubbles and so on, but so far now it is becoming fairly inefficient. Okay? Hence, it means that in traditional Keynesian thinking, it means that fiscal policy should be implemented in countries where we are in trouble in terms of deflation, risk of deflation, for instance, like in Europe, and this is what should be done. Unfortunately, it is exactly the contrary which is done in Europe now. Our authorities have decided to have what we call austerity policies, which decide to reduce the level of public government expenditure, which decide to reduce wages also, or to stabilize incomes of the popular classes. No. So the situation is very bad, and we have the worst policy mix possible. We have very accommodating monetary policy, but it is today becoming inefficient, and we have a very restrictive fiscal policy, whereas we should have a very, in fact, stimulating fiscal policy. So this is why I would, to conclude on my answer, I understand that Mr. Aristides criticized this type of policy, quantitative easing, but I would ask to him, what would have you done? What should be done? What have you done? If not quantitative easing, okay? And if you don't do anything, like to some extent in Europe, look at what's happening. We have a deflation, risk of deflation. So the criticism is very easy to make, but if you don't have any alternative policy, unless making revolution, I don't think he was mentioning that, I don't see what could have been done, this differently. So I would be less critical than he is.
I just, this question of the Philippe Perez, I asked this, without quantitative easing, what should we do? Because I do the correlation between the United States did the quantitative easing and it's growing, even UK too did the quantitative easing is growing, and United and European Union is not doing better. But UK and United States did fiscal policies that, he did that. He said that it's not quantitative easing, but the fiscal policy that they do. I don't know. But another answer is another question is that since the value of the assets in the markets are like 85 and 120% of the pre-crisis numbers, and we do not grow the production, and the margins are still the same, not grow, then what the relation between the two periods, pre-crisis and the period now.
I'm not sure I understood the question.
Yeah, I say the value of the assets is the same now and the pre-crisis period, okay. But the production and the markets did not grow, and okay. I don't know, maybe just
sure. Okay. Yes.
What do you think about the exchange rate policy in the Eurozone for these two pessimistic scenarios, fragmentation and consolidation? About the exchange rate policy that would be made in these two scenarios? Thank you.
Consolidation and fragmentation. First, speaking of fiscal policies, I don't think you can compare or can think that the fiscal policy in the US and in the UK were the same. They were quite opposite, in fact. In the US, it is true that fiscal policy was very expansionist in the sense that the government deficit went up very much, and the government let government deficit go up. Whereas in the UK, it's quite the contrary. Mr. Cameron reduced very drastically expenditures
and he had a pro-cyclical in fact, policy. He did not fight the recession or the crisis by reducing, by increasing expenditure. On the contrary, by reducing expenditure. So this is why I would not say that in the UK the fiscal policy was expansionary. And I don't think Mr. Orestes, who is a Keynesian, agrees with Mr. Cameron policy. I think it's was very dangerous policy. So. Now, the second question you asked about the level, you mentioned that the level of assets, the value of assets is still very high, as high as it was before the crisis, and yet we don't have any impact on the economy. Well, maybe one answer, I'm not sure it's the only one, I'm not sure it's the best one, I don't know, but I think that, what about the level of debt? Between 2007 and 2000 and today, 14, we had a high level of debt, public debt, but also, except the US, where debt has been reduced, private debt has been reduced. In other countries, in Europe, Spain, in Great Britain, in Ireland, in France, in Germany, private debt is still extremely high. And since the level of price has been declining, and there is a risk of decline in price, inflation, the real level of debt is very important. So you have to take into account not only the value of assets on the financial market, for instance, but you have to take into account the value of debt, the real value of debt. And now we have a risk of what Fisher called the debt deflation process. And this is for me what is the most important thing to look at. Is there a risk of having deflation in the context of a high level of private debt and public debt? Okay. So this is why today I'm fairly anxious, not to say pessimistic about Europe, because we have this problem of deflation, risk of deflation in the context of a high level of debt. And I don't think this is a wealth effect. Having high level of assets on the stock exchange plays a very important role because of this problem of the debt. But maybe it's not the only answer, but this is what I would answer to your question. Okay? Now, you asked me in the two scenarios, pessimistic one, consolidation and fragmentation, what would be the exchange rate policy? This is the question. Okay, so for instance, as I mentioned, in fragmentation, each country is playing its own role, no cooperation at the international level. So you have currency competition. In other words, each country is going to beg its neighbor to try to play the role of depreciate its currency, for instance, if it is in trouble in terms of trade balance. And we will have a very unstable and very difficult situation. So, exchange rate policy would be that kind of policy. Okay? Non-cooperative and beg thy neighbor type of policies, type of exchange. Okay? In terms of consolidation now, the scenario of consolidation, what would be the since financial markets and financial players are the dominant actors, in fact we will have a very stable and very flexible exchange rates. So in this context, governments don't play a major role. There are no exchange rate policies on the part of central bank. Central bank, in fact, accommodate only the situation. In other words, they don't try to have a target in terms of exchange rate. They let the market play the role. They decide which is the role. So here you have no exchange rate policy and you have a very unstable situation. Okay? By the way, this is the situation we have now with respect to the exchange rate of the dollar versus the euro. I don't know if you look at this exchange rate, which is for us of course very important. You can see that the dollar and the euro-dollar exchange rate is very stable. 2 years ago, until the recent month, the euro was appreciating very much. Although we had the recession, risk of deflation in Europe. Why? It's because our rate of interest were slightly higher than in the US,
And also because the financial markets, this is what you mentioned, paradoxically was behaving very well. We had high level of prices in the stock exchange. So there were money to make on the financial market in Europe. And since two or 3 months now, it's very recent, the currency, the exchange rate of euro has been depreciating a lot. Why? It's because the Fed decided that it will raise again in the near future interest rate, we don't know when, whereas Mr. Draghi has said that he will still maintain the interest rate at a low level. So it seems to me that expectations in the market are such that they think that there is no risk if you maintain your assets in the euro market, that you lose some money and you will grow in the US economy. Besides, we have the risk of crash on the bond market maybe in Europe, because the rate of bonds have been going very, very low, and maybe they will go up again in the future if there are some problems. So there is a lot of uncertainty with respect to the behavior of the bond markets in the Eurozone. So this is why investors are very cautious and prefer to get out of Europe and go in the US, maybe where the situation seems to be more stable. But maybe I'm wrong, and it's a very difficult situation. Question? No, I thought you were raising. No more questions? Okay. Anyway, thank you for your patience. I'll be happy to talk to you outside this conference, and please also, if you want to write me by email, you can have my email address. I think it is on the paper I sent you. If you have some question about our paper, some other question, I'll be happy to answer.